Hello, everyone, and welcome to Art of the Week with Katya, episode 12. Finally, after that big two-parter, we have also, yet again, something a little bit new. So you're joining me today right outside of the church of Santa Maria Gloriosa dei Frari, also known as just Frari, in Venezia. And again, someday we will do an episode just about this church because it's really an extraordinary church. Um, but this episode is actually about an art type, a particular kind of art object that happened both in the Western world and in the Eastern world. And we're actually going to focus on an art object in Bosnia that I had the pleasure of seeing, and we're going to talk a lot more about that. So this object is called the iconostasis, and it is a partition, a wall, basically, that separates the altar space from the rest of the nave, the chorus, the main part of the church. And this particular art form, it came from the very early Middle Ages, and they were very low railings, as we will see actually the one in Torcello. As I mentioned in episode 11, the screen in Torcello, we would talk a lot more about screens, and that is what this episode is all about. But over time, the partitions became larger and larger, and they became an art form of their own. In the Eastern Church, this happened in the 1200s, the 13th century. In the Western churches, like this one, it happens in the 1300s, the 14th century. So this church was built in 1338, and we're about to go in and see what the iconostasis, as it is called often in general, it is called the ponte in Italian. Every single language has a special name for this. Ponte in Italian actually means bridge. And we will see how this partition, this wall, isn't just a divider. In fact, it's actually meant to unify the space as well as act as a specific divider for specific things. So this church was built at the height, though, of this art form, and we will go inside a little bit and have a look. We will also have a look on our particular iconostasis that we are focusing on in the church of the Cathedral of the Nativity of Theotokos in Bosnia. So we see here the Gothic choir screen of the interior of Santa Maria Gloriosa dei Frari. And as I mentioned, right, in the West, it was around during this century that screens became really an art form of their own kind. And as we can see, this really is a structure that has been created here in order to facilitate and to very much manipulate the interior space of the church. So let's get into this a little bit. Now, in the West, as I mentioned, specifically in Italian, we use this word ponte, which means bridge, actually, and it's because it's in a way supposed to be a bridge to the heavenly, to the sanctuary that's behind it. But what's interesting is that in the West, specifically, there is a little bit more of a emphasis on the partition part of this particular artistic object, on the fact that it is a screen, it is a wall that very much separates the lay area of where the lay people were and the holy space. And what's also interesting is that as a result, it also facilitates and redirects sight. It recreates very much a sense of not only of exclusivity, but also of controlling where the sight of the layperson is going. And for example, we also see that. So here in the Madonna of the Church by Jan van Eyck, which is done a little bit about 100 years after the Church of Frari is built, but it's very much, this painting is taking place in a northern Gothic church. And we see actually in this painting a little bit of the control of vision and that partition. Now, part of what's revolutionary a bit about this painting is the fact that the Madonna is in the partition space. She's in the space of the lay people. She's not in the holy space exactly, because the holy space is actually here, as we can see. And if you zoom in very closely, you actually can see through this screen, which is a Gothic, Western Gothic screen, very similar to the one that we see in Frari. We actually see angels who are speaking, who are talking, and looking at Mary through their side of the screen, the holy side of the screen. And in this way, we really get an understanding of how this control of vision is so incredibly emphasized in the West. And then here, as we can see, this is also the screen that is in Nuremberg. And what's interesting is that, so in the West, what happens is, especially in the northern parts of the West, a lot of these screens end up taken down during the Reformation. Or in Italy, in northern Italy anyway, they're most likely rethought, more or less, due to the Reformation, because the Reformation affected Italy and parts of Europe that remained Catholic as much as it affected all the other countries that became Protestant. But we also know, as I said in the beginning of this episode, that screens are much older than the 1300s. And we saw in our last episode, actually a couple of episodes ago, we talked a little bit about the screen in Torcello, which is a much earlier medieval church, and it's made up of much earlier pieces of objects. And we know actually that the screen comes from early Byzantine Christianity, and it's seen everywhere. And the thing is that, but we know that this screen, as we can see, it's a little bit lower as far as the control of vision is concerned. You can still see from at least waist level up. You can definitely see and access the altar space, which is what makes it different from those Gothic screens, which really redirect any kind of vision. Now, moving on to our real main screen that we're going to talk about, considering the East versus the West. So Bosnia and Herzegovina, as it is called today, is one of the many Eastern European countries that really tries to underline the point of the meeting of East and West. And in many ways, the city is very much equipped, has very much been part of many histories that can describe this kind of a meeting. And one of the ways in which it describes this point is the church that we can see here, the Eastern Orthodox Church of the Cathedral of the Nativity of Theotokos. Now, actually, this name very much refers also to the Eastern Church, talking about the differences between the East and the West. As we've talked about a little bit, we have this interesting moment of icons and iconoclasm. But what happens after that era, and kind of as a result of that era, is very much a refinement of icons as an art form. And the word Theotokos actually refers to an icon. So we're actually looking directly at the interior of this church. It's a beautiful, beautiful church that I got to see in Sarajevo, in Bosnia. And the church itself is named after this icon, and it refers specifically to an image of Mary, which we can see right here, where she is acting kind of as the throne to Christ. And it's a very specific image. She has to be holding him in a specific way. It depends on even which shoulder he's lying against and how she's seated. And it has to do with the various forms and the various ways in which Mary and Christ participate in imagery, and therefore how they are to be related to as an icon, which is very interesting. But now, moving on, or moving back to our point, our discussion, which was about the screen. Here is the screen. Now, see, in the West, we have the screen in churches, as we saw, but it takes on a very different significance in the Eastern Church. And as we can see here, this really is a very magnificent piece of art. And as we can see here, it is gigantic. It is multiple stories high, which is, again, not something that you really see in the West. The West takes an interest in the screen, but it does not become an art form quite like this. In the East, it takes on something else, something that really is a very big deal in the East, and let's talk about it. So the thing is that the use of the screen in the East, it very much actually, not only does it exist as still a manipulation of space, which is really quite interesting, but it also exists as actually a way of blending the space as well. And the thing is that so it does this because over time the screen became not only a structure, but it becomes, as we can see here, basically a framing structure for the images of saints, which in the East are called icons. And just like the icon that the church is named after, we can see that these are very central to the practices and the way that the Eastern Church, is even designed architecturally and set up artistically. So the point of this screen, why it's there, is the idea is that the tradition of the Eucharist, the creation of that moment, is so incredibly sacred that it should not be beheld directly by the lay people. What's interesting is that this screen, while it originally acted as a partition between the heavenly and the earthly, as we talked about a little bit as well in Torcello, it started to exist in kind of a gray area between the heavenly and the earthly. And we know this in one of the ways, for example, the icons that are placed inside of these frames were sometimes kissed by the priest before he entered to do the ritual of the Eucharist, which is actually very important because this is the kind of practice that generally goes around relics. And as a result, the icons, the images of the saints themselves, end up having a transitive property wherein they almost become like extensions of the bodies of the saints themselves. And as a result, the screen itself actually becomes a sacred thing to look upon as well. But another way in which this again is kind of redirecting sight, but it's not exactly controlling in this case, because as we see, the sacredness of the sanctuary has kind of come and brought the screen into it. Some screens in the East, for example, we're looking at the screen of the Church of Hagia Sophia of Ohrid in Macedonia. This is a sketch of it. Some screens have, as we see, a gate here. In some cultures, they're considered a staircase. This is very much using symbology related to heaven. And again, yes, it is separating the heavenly and the earthly, but not in a very written in stone, pardon the pun, kind of way like in the West. It's really gotten its own art form here, wherein the screen is itself also a sacred structure, and as a result, it's really transcending it's really transcending the role of being a barrier per se between earth and heaven. And another way that we also see this is that there's also a particular icon image in the Eastern Church that was often placed inside of these screens. This is also, by the way, part of why their name iconostasis comes from. This is where they place the icons within these frames. But one of those icons that also happens is called the Communion of Apostles, which is actually the Eastern Church's particular icon for the Last Supper, which is also, by the way, in the West, a highly, highly canonized image that has a gazillion traditions that changed over time from, as we know, from one of the most famous things that Leonardo da Vinci ever painted, right? That's discussed in art history, that's discussed world round. Everybody knows his Last Supper scene, but that came from a tradition that he was changing very much in the way that he was doing things. But there was a tradition as much in the West as it was in the East. And as a result, the thing is, the Last Supper is the moment where we get this particular ritual of practicing the Eucharist, the changing of the wine into the blood of Christ and the bread into the flesh of Christ, comes from that supper. So the fact that that icon can exist in this place, can be prayed to, therefore, by the lay people, we really have a transcendence here where the screen exists. It's there in order to very much create this partition between heaven and earth, the heavenly being the sanctuary, the earthly being where the lay people are. But the lay people aren't exactly sitting back and not participating. They are very much invited to participate because the screen is trying to invite the lay people to heaven as much as possible. And we can see in this particular screen, it's really a glorious structure. We can see this is pre-restoration. We see some of the original, more traditional iconographic images here that were put in. And a lot of these screens also in the East, as opposed to the West, are made out of, this particular one is made out of gold that is inlaid on wood. I actually had the privilege of talking to one of the restorationists who was working on restoring the altar, and she explained to me that she was working on the inlaid gold. And we also see, for example, a screen here in Egypt that is also using very similar materials and of gold on wood with these paintings. And as we saw from our screen was also the paintings that are currently on it, which is the first picture that you saw of it, the picture that I've been showing you of it, has paintings that were obviously much more recently done. Of icons. Nonetheless, this tradition of icon worship is very important. It's very central to the Eastern Church. In fact, it's really, as you can see, it's become an art form of its own kind that even the church itself is named after. And in that sense, the church is existing inside the icon as much as the icon is existing inside the church, which is, it's beautiful. It's fantastic. It's an amazing way in which art can be incredibly, it can transgress even its own size and its own significance to be both existing within a space and controlling the space in which it's existing. And so, I mean, as we've seen, right, in the West, we have these very stone based altar screens, iconostases, and most of which have, if they have a representation of saints, they're sculptures. And we see finally the one here in San Marco, which is also older, right? It's only a century after Maria Assunta in Torcello. And we see again the very low standing screen with the columns supporting the statues of the saints, whereas the saints are carved into the stone Gothic screens of Frari and in Nuremberg Cathedral. As we see, it's very different in the West versus the East. In the West, it was an art form that existed in the Middle Ages kind of for a period, and then it went away. And whereas in the East, it's really become not only an art form that is, it's absolutely breathtaking. If you ever have the opportunity to see a screen like this, I highly recommend the screen in Sarajevo. Absolutely glows. The gold, it looks as if it's pure gold. And it is very much an art form of its own kind that truly announces itself as an art form of its own kind. And it definitely existed in the West, as we can see here, moving out. But also, it's something that really became its true, an art form of its own kind, truly, I would say, in the East. Our real iconostasis screen in question was out of the Nativity of Theotokos in Bosnia, brought to you by popular demand this time. But it was my pleasure. It's a truly beautiful sight to see, and I highly recommend going to see it. I used, as we saw, some Venetian examples of this art form to show that it was practiced in the West and in the East, but it really became an art form of its own kind in the East, as we saw. And even though that this is the case in the modern era of using televisions as well, televising the practice of the Eucharist has also brought forth a lot of questions about the screen, how it's used, whether or not it should be continued to be used, all of these points. Thank you so much. Join me next time on Art of the Week with Katya. See you soon.